By 1925, Europe was tired of fear. 7 years had passed since the guns of World War I fell silent. The trenches had long been abandoned, and grass had begun to grow over the scars of battlefields. Cities once shattered by artillery were rebuilding. Railways ran again. Factories reopened. Markets filled with life. For the first time in years, something unfamiliar began to appear. Cautious trust. But 1925 was not a year of celebration. It was a year of testing whether peace could survive. The physical wounds of the Great War were still visible in northern France and Belgium. Reconstruction continued slowly. Workers rebuilt homes stone by stone. War cemeteries expanded across the countryside, endless rows of white crosses marking the cost of conflict. Visitors traveled to these grave sites in silence. Mothers stood before names carved in stone. Wives brought flowers to husbands who would never return. The war might have ended in 1918, but grief had no timetable. Meanwhile, across Europe, governments faced a difficult question. How do you rebuild trust between former enemies? Germany in 1925 was no longer collapsing as it had in 1923. Hyperinflation had been controlled. The economy showed signs of recovery. Foreign loans and industrial growth brought temporary stability. Streets once filled with desperation now carried cautious optimism. But beneath that stability, national pride remained wounded. Many Germans still believed the Treaty of Versailles had humiliated their country. Veterans felt they had sacrificed everything only to be blamed for defeat. Though extremist groups were weaker than before, they had not disappeared. They waited, watching for moments of weakness. France too carried fear. Though victorious in the war, France had suffered enormous loss. Entire regions had been destroyed. Nearly every family had buried someone. The French government prioritized security above all else. It feared a resurgent Germany. It feared another invasion. Peace required trust, but trust was difficult when memory was fresh. In October 1925, a significant diplomatic breakthrough occurred. The signing of the Locarno Treaties. Representatives from Germany, France, Belgium, Britain, and Italy gathered in the Swiss town of Locarno. For the first time since the war, former enemies met not as combatants or accusers, but as negotiators. The agreements guaranteed Germany's western borders and promised peaceful resolution of disputes. It was not a perfect solution, but it symbolized something powerful: willingness to cooperate. The spirit of Locarno spread across Europe. Newspapers spoke of reconciliation. Leaders shook hands publicly. The possibility of lasting peace felt more realistic than it had in years. For many citizens, 1925 seemed like proof that humanity had learned from its mistakes. Yet even in this hopeful atmosphere, the world remained fragile. Eastern Europe continued to experience instability. Borders created after the collapse of empires were still disputed. Ethnic tensions simmered. Young democracies struggled to maintain authority. While Western Europe celebrated diplomacy, other regions faced uncertainty. Beyond politics, society itself was changing. The generation shaped by World War I had matured. Veterans were now husbands, fathers, and workers. Some had rebuilt their lives successfully. Others remained haunted by memories of trench warfare, mud, gas attacks, endless artillery. There was still little understanding of psychological trauma. Many veterans carried silent pain. Some found comfort in camaraderie groups. Others turned to alcohol or isolation. The world honored their service publicly but rarely addressed their suffering privately. At the same time, a new cultural energy was rising. In cities like Berlin and Paris, art, music, and literature flourished. Jazz clubs filled with laughter. Writers questioned nationalism and authority. Architects experimented with modern design. Society seemed eager to move forward, to escape the shadow of the trenches. Young people danced as if to prove that life had defeated death. Yet older generations watched cautiously. They remembered how quickly optimism in 1914 had turned into catastrophe. 1925 stood at a delicate crossroads. On one path lay cooperation, economic growth, and diplomatic progress. On the other lay unresolved resentment, fragile governments, and the lingering belief that strength mattered more than compromise. The Locarno Treaties gave Europe a chance. Germany's admission into the League of Nations followed soon after, further integrating it into international diplomacy. For a brief moment in history, it seemed that former enemies could truly become partners. But peace in 1925 was built on agreements, not on complete forgiveness. Reparations still burdened Germany. France still feared vulnerability. Britain sought balance without deep involvement. The United States, though influential economically, remained politically distant from European commitments. The structure of peace was complex and delicate. Ordinary people, however, simply wanted stability. They wanted steady jobs, safe streets, and a future without war. They wanted their children to grow up without the sound of artillery in the distance. They wanted remembrance without repetition. And in 1925, for the first time since 1918, it felt possible. The Great War had reshaped borders, economies, and identities. It had destroyed empires and created new nations. It had shattered illusions of glory and replaced them with realism. By 1925, Europe understood the cost of war more clearly than ever before. But understanding does not always guarantee prevention. History would later reveal how fragile this hopeful period truly was. Political extremism had not vanished. Economic stability depended heavily on international loans. Trust between nations was genuine, but cautious. The peace of 1925 was like thin ice over deep water. Still, for one brief year, Europe dared to believe, dared to negotiate instead of threaten, dared to rebuild instead of retaliate, dared to trust instead of fear. 1925 was not loud like the battles of Verdun or the Somme. It was not chaotic like the hyperinflation crisis. It was not explosive like revolutions. Instead, it was quiet and hopeful. It was the year Europe tried to trust again, and though history would test that trust in the years to come. 1925 remains a reminder that even after unimaginable destruction, humanity seeks cooperation. Because after years of war, hunger, and anger, the greatest act of courage is not fighting, it is choosing peace.